Media objectivity.
We need to be able to have the conversations about what does Canadian multiculturalism mean. When we think about an iceberg of culture and the top part of it is food and fiesta, beneath the water are all those things that make the culture operate. And people just don't have an interest in delving into those questions and finding out why people do things. And that's the area where the interesting conversations would take place. And it's where the courageous conversations would take place as well, because that's where values would bump up against one another. But we stick to those superficial conversations. And I think often that's where the media stops as well, because once you delve into those deep questions, it becomes more controversial. You may get more backlash. So why go there?
With what we know about diversity in media, we have to look at how it impacts objectivity in media reporting. We need to explore this, at least in part, because many people intuit that gender-based violence and gendered issues reported by women journalists or broadcasters are covered in a way that we would consider more responsible, more accurate, and/or more in-depth, so as to take into consideration the various ways in which patriarchy, misogyny, racism, ableism, and other forms of stigma and oppression impact these issues.
Women have different experiences than men, right? So we're going to be bringing those experiences even to the conversations that we have with our colleagues sometimes. I think sometimes your own experience as a woman might lead you to ask different questions than a male colleague might. So in the example that you used about snow plowing, I might ask the city about that, or, and it would be the same for if you're looking at seniors issues or you're looking at people with a disability. If you have those people in your life, you might be asking those questions more.
While it is generally understood that increasing the number of women in newsrooms is a positive move toward increasing diversity, several studies and reports find that there is no sex of journalist difference in how news is covered. Regardless of the number of women journalists, the most recent studies suggest that only up to 1/3 of news coverage featured women protagonists. Even in the UK and the US, where gender diversity in newsrooms is at or near parity, the bias toward men as protagonists is persistent. In her book, Gendered News, Canadian political scientist and professor Elizabeth Goodyear Grant finds that the causes of gender bias or lack of gender sensitivity in news coverage are too deeply ingrained and complex for staffing reforms to be an effective solution. Goodyear Grant goes on to say that male-dominated professions tend to result in women conforming to workplace norms and routines rather than confronting them. Other analyses found that it might be similarities in attitudes toward being a journalist that result in women adopting and being judged by men's values and standards. Why does any of this matter? Why does it matter if newsrooms are male-dominated? Why does it matter if, even where newsrooms are reaching gender parity, women journalists are reporting news based on men's values and standards? Why does it matter that nearly half of all Canadian newsrooms are exclusively staffed by white journalists? Show me a man who thinks he's objective, and I'll show you a man who's deceiving himself, said Henry Luce, who founded Time, Life, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated magazines. In its efforts to remain completely objective, journalism has long been taught and practiced as journalists taking a view from nowhere, in that they are strictly observers and are able to remain objective by not holding a particular view of their own, or by being able to set their viewpoint entirely to the side on the issues on which they report. As a historically male-dominated profession, and with men being considered rational, while women are typically considered emotional, male subjectivity is what we have come to consider objectivity. However, several authors have begun to write about the harms of journalistic objectivity. The view from nowhere cannot be completely objective, as it still stems from the social location of the journalist, the media outlet, and conventional journalistic practices. Too often, bias is interpreted as differences between journalists or between the journalist and the person or people about whom they are writing, when it should be a recognition of the journalist's knowledge, expertise, and life experience, as it is in much academic research, when researchers situate themselves in the research to make clear where they are coming from and how it may impact the research they are conducting. As journalist Lewis Raven Wallace says in his book, The View from Somewhere, dispensing with the myth of objectivity is not about rejecting the possibility of truth altogether. It's about accepting the possibility of multiple truths. Discussing larger social issues and structures when covering stories does not mean the story is no longer truthful or accurate. Rather, it provides a more complete picture of why gender-based violence continues to happen, or why we still have not achieved gender equality, or why Indigenous people continue to be victimized at higher rates than white people, or are more likely to live in poverty.
I think a lot about who has power and who has influence, because they're not the same thing. And we think about them like the same thing, right? Like Kim Kardashian's an influencer. She doesn't have any power. Well, okay, she does because she's a billionaire. That was a bad example. Maybe my example better. Okay, so I have 18,000 followers on Twitter. That's a little bit of influence. It's not a ton, but it's a little bit of influence. I have no power. I have no capacity to change the things that need to be changed. And so we often confuse influence with power. And we think that Indigenous people, because they have influence in certain things, that they may have power to change those things. And we don't. The power rests in media. It rests in who owns these large outlets. And so what they need to do is cede some of that power. That's really the only thing that they can do. If you have power, you have to be willing to cede power. And one way that they can cede power is to allow stories to be told through their outlets without needing to control them. That if you're going to hire an Indigenous journalist to tell stories, and not just Indigenous stories, because everything is an Indigenous story. I shop at grocery stores. I buy gas. I have a car. I live in Niagara. Everything that happens that interacts with me in some way is an Indigenous story. And so if they're going to hire Indigenous journalists or, Indigenous, or journalists of color, let them tell the stories. Encourage them to tell the stories. I have a book coming out, which I haven't talked about until this moment, but I do have a book coming out, and and I'm being edited by a white woman, and the publisher is a white publisher. It's a white Christian publisher, and we had talked early on that she was hesitant as a white woman to be editing a Native woman. Like, how do you tell a Native woman, don't say that or something? Like, she was really struggling with that. And I said, that's okay. Like, we'll work on it. I have a good feeling about you. We'll deal with things as they come up. And I had just written 3 chapters on how terrible everything had been. I've talking about residential schools and, epidemics and and the clearing of the plains and the eastern seaboard and all of these things. And then I say, after this period of upheaval and, of upheaval, and she highlights it, and she sends it back to me for editing, and she highlights it and she says, this phrase really doesn't do justice to what you have just said. Like, you have described all these horrific things, and then I call it a period of upheaval. That's self-censorship, right? That's being aware that I'm writing for a white gaze without even really thinking about it. And so she highlighted it and she said, this really doesn't do this justice. And so I was like, okay, after this period of genocide and ethnic cleansing, which was exactly what it was. And then she didn't say anything after that, because that was what I had described. And then I scattered that language throughout the book. If it was genocide, I called it genocide. And so I named it. And what she did, she gave me permission to not censor myself. She gave me permission to say the things that needed to be said. But that requires media to cede power. And so that's what they can do when they have journalists from communities that have been pushed to the margins. They can encourage them to tell the stories in the right way. And that may mean telling their journalist, I don't think that phrase is really accurate to what, it doesn't really convey what you're talking about here, and giving them permission to not self-censor, because I didn't realize I had done it. She caught it. And I will credit her every single time for doing that, because she made this a much better book. It's a much better book because she caught that and gave me permission to expand on it. And journalism, the stories that they tell about Canada could be so much better. We can't change these things if we don't name these things. If we pretend like they never happened, or they're just part of our distant past, or they're just this random bad thing that happened for no apparent reason. Wow, who could have seen that? We're just condemning ourselves to constantly doing it over and over and over again, and we're still doing it.
Jody Santos, an award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker, and who has reported for print and television news for more than 20 years, writes in her book, Daring to Feel, that some biases are healthy, that we should be outraged at the number of women who will be abused by a partner in their lifetime, that journalists should oppose violence rather than be compelled to tell both sides of a story and sanitize the brutality of life events. She asks why news media tell stories of intimate partner violence as singular events rather than as the devastating epidemic it is. Santos finds through her research and discussion by psychologist Rebecca Campbell that rape cannot truly be understood from a position of emotional neutrality, of academic objectivity, because these problems are at their core emotional. Journalists who have been socialized to unquestionably seek objectivity through balance must recognize that in most cases, anti-woman violence cannot be balanced. When journalists come from different backgrounds and have different lived experiences, and management permits them to take a view from somewhere, we will end up with more truthful, accurate, and complete stories.
Self-censorship is bad. It's a survival strategy. They have to self-censor, tell the story in a way that they know is going to get to print, which may be better than nothing. At least it gets out there and it gets told, but it's still a whitewashed story, and I use that word deliberately. It's still a story told for the white reader that won't upset the white people, that won't upset the white advertisers, the white funders. And that's where you see the explosion of independent media, of blogs and Substacks and Twitter platforms and independently owned media that struggles for funding and struggles for financing, but has to be out there to tell these stories that are really important. A lot of people think that, I don't see color. I don't see color. I just see you as a person. I don't see you as Native. I just see you as a person. I don't see you as Black. I just see you as a person. Well, if you don't see these things, if you don't see me as Native, if you don't see my friend Kellen as Black, if you don't see, the migrant workers, if you don't see these things, then you don't see the inequities. If you don't see me as a woman, you don't see the inequities that complicate my life. And so to treat us all the same and to ask us all the same questions as if we exist on a level playing field is to use that white lens, because it assumes a level of sameness that just doesn't exist, that just isn't there.
For the non-Indigenous community, I would ask them to not hide from discomfort. Ask why they're uncomfortable. And that goes for reporters. If you're avoiding a topic, ask yourself why. Be emotionally intelligent and emotionally mature.
Key takeaways. There is no absolutely objective journalism, as everyone's work is influenced by their social location, lived experience, knowledge, and perspectives. Eschewing traditionally understood objectivity does not mean telling untrue or incomplete stories. It encourages the idea that there are multiple truths, which results in more complete stories. Make space for a variety of experiences and responses, and consider telling stories from a variety of perspectives. Consider if and how the bias of your sources and the institutions they represent will impact your story. Ensure that seeking balance doesn't cause harm to survivors or equity-deserving groups.